7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. We have ignition and liftoff from Cape Canaveral Air Station of the Air Force Delta II launch vehicle carrying the new GPS-2R satellite. We have had an anomaly. We just had an anomaly of the Delta II launch vehicle from Cape Canaveral Air Station.
Rocket failures have a tendency to happen very fast. A successful rocket launch is a combination of thousands of factors all working together in the correct sequence. Pressurized metal tanks, miles of wiring, oxidizer and fuel pumps, generators, ducts, valves, gimbals, turbines, heat exchangers, guidance systems, orientation mechanisms, and millions of lines of computer code all need to work exactly the way they're supposed to, and if any single one of those factors is off by a fraction, everything goes up in smoke, quite literally, in a split second. It's all very sensitive, and when it goes wrong, it's almost never clear exactly what happened right away. There's simply an explosion or a puff of smoke, and then hours upon hours of complete confusion. A perfect example of the outsider reaction is this moment from Firefly Alpha's debut launch, as it was being watched by our favorite rocket VTuber Clear Soy and featuring a cameo from Everyday Astronaut.
That's a good
anomaly.
Pretty close anomaly.
There has been an anomaly.
Move the anomaly team to press user MLP.
これ何これ何が起こったの
Shoot.
It's just utter confusion. First the rocket was there, then it wasn't. The thing is, most people tend to tune out of a rocket launch after it fails. The exciting part is over. Even the failure itself is rather exciting, so long as nobody gets hurt, so they usually end up missing what actually happened to bring it to that point. So today, let's examine why rockets fail. This isn't going to be a comprehensive list. There have been hundreds of failures over the course of the space age, but rather a history of evolution. We'll be leaving out spacecraft-specific failures such as Apollo 13 or Soyuz 11, and we'll be focusing on the launch vehicles, discussing why early rockets failed as often as they did, how those problems were fixed, and how new technology brings new problems with new solutions. From the first efforts to take us to the new horizon that we continue to strive for today, let's discuss what happens when the pointy end is not up and the flamey end is not down. Do note that some of these early days will contain a lack of media thanks to Soviet and other military secrecy, which simply couldn't happen today, which brings us to a point about personal data. Your personal data is important. At this point, most of us are aware that our data is being bought, sold, and traded around the world by various data brokers, and the problem is made worse by data breaches of corporate servers and people search sites that have detailed files on millions of people. They have your name, your social security number, your date of birth, your employment and address history, even your IP information and your spending habits. This can result in actual cybercrimes such as identity theft, or less illegal but still shady practices of companies being able to target vulnerable and disadvantaged people. Ever seen an ad that relates specifically to a problem in your life, encouraging you to indulge in that product even though it might not actually help you? That's what data brokers do. I know personally that I have had more than enough of automated scam calls that are well aware I've had financial problems in the past, and they didn't get that knowledge from me. So, enter a solution. Today's video is brought to you by Incogni. Incogni is a service that searches out where your information has ended up online and removes you from the lists of scammers and anyone else who may want to use it. You don't have to do anything except sign up, give them permission to work for your data protection, and then sit back and watch. Incogni will contact these data brokers, request that your information be removed, and deal with any roadblocks the brokers may put up to stop the removal process. They'll keep asking, pestering these companies until they finally give in and take you off the list. Incogni is constantly monitoring and updating what they know to make sure you don't end up being recycled back into the system. You'll have access to a dashboard that shows you how many data broker sites and lists you've ended up on, and you'll be able to see Incogni's process in getting you off of them. I signed up today, and within 1 hour, they've sent 36 removal requests and completed 16 of those. It's fast, it's simple, and it's a safe way to fight back against this nebulous industry. To sign up for yourself, go to incogni.com/DKIS today. That's incogni.com/DKIS. Be sure to use that link to help support this channel. Thank you, Incogni, for sponsoring this video and for doing what you do. One question to be addressed before we get into it is, where do we begin? The origins of rocketry can be traced arguably all the way back to 10th century China with the invention of fireworks, or even further back to the invention of gunpowder, but let's try and think about application. Sadly, we won't be starting with Juan Hu's attempt to launch himself to space in a chair of fireworks in 1390. It's an amusing story, but there's not even any direct evidence that it actually happened. Instead, we're going to start today with the first person who actually tried to use rockets to demonstrate that they could be used for spaceflight, Robert H. Goddard. Goddard was not the first to think about the concept. That goes back to Konstantin Tsiolkovsky and maybe even earlier. Again, Chinese rockets demonstrated some very interesting and ahead of their time stuff, but he was the first one to try and make it work. Goddard pioneered the use of liquid-fueled rockets in 1926, over half a decade after he published his work, A Method of Reaching Extreme Altitudes, which he was hesitant to make public because he had not yet finished designing his rocket engine. The ideal fuel combinations had already been worked out, but Goddard was the first one to try to create a rocket engine capable of the immense amount of thrust that we know today. He primarily achieved this via use of the de Laval nozzle. Originally developed for use in steam turbines, these nozzles are pinched in the middle, making them capable of accelerating propellant flow to supersonic speeds. This works by forcing the gases into a tighter and tighter space, increasing the pressure and therefore the speed. Once they reach the pinch point or throat, they're moving at the speed of sound, and inertia causes the gas to speed up even more as it exits the wide end of the nozzle, now moving at supersonic speeds. Before applying these nozzles to his design, Goddard's experiment with powder rockets showed that they were only converting about 2% of their thermal energy into thrust and kinetic energy. Incorporating de Laval nozzles brought the efficiency of his own engine design up to about 40% by 1915, then 63% after several static fires and addition of a combustion chamber. His exhaust velocities in tests exceeded 7,000 feet or 2,132 meters per second. In 1926, it was finally time to test his first rocket. You may notice a few things about this contraption. First, it doesn't really resemble modern rockets at all. It's got a nozzle and some propellant lines, but not much else. The combustion chamber and nozzle are completely separate from the oxygen and fuel tanks below it, protected from the nozzle's exhaust by an asbestos cone, and it all sits on this wire stand that does not go with it when it's ignited. Unsurprisingly, this first attempt at a design did not fare too well. It shot up quickly a mere 41 feet into the air, curved to the left, and landed in a cabbage patch some 180 feet away from the launch site, with the lower half of its nozzle completely burned off. While it could hardly be called a successful flight, it was a successful demonstration of principles. The velocities of the rocket were exactly what Goddard wanted. A second flight of this first design performed similarly, rising only 49 feet, so he went to work stabilizing it, first with aerodynamic fins and movable vanes in the exhaust controlled by a gyroscope to control and steer it. Goddard would, by 1929, gain a small sponsorship from the Guggenheim family and move his rocketry work to Roswell, New Mexico. By now, his rocket was redesigned into a much more familiar, though still primitive state, and had a more solid launch tower. The launches went much better now, frequently reaching between 1,000 and 2,000 feet in altitude, with his primary problems being component burn-through, mainly in the thrust chamber. Rocket engines get hot, very hot, and these early designs didn't have the best cooling systems. Goddard had in fact designed a regenerative cooling system, but it was deemed too complicated at the time. Regenerative cooling works by circulating the fuel, which is usually kept very cold, around the combustion chamber to absorb some of its heat, a process still used by many engines today. Since he couldn't quite get it running in the time he wanted, he opted for an alternative, a system that sprayed excess gasoline which would evaporate around the inside wall of the combustion chamber, but this became ineffective the larger the rockets became. He returned to his prototype regenerative cooling system, and it worked well enough for one of his L-series rockets to reach its highest altitude, 2.7 kilometers. Unfortunately, the United States wasn't ready for his work, especially with World War II right around the corner, and the tests wouldn't go much further than this. Goddard's rockets weren't really intended to reach high altitudes anyway. His intention was to test and refine the engine designs so that they could start to remain stable at higher altitudes, because that was always the failure. The rockets would perform well at first, but sooner or later, once the guidance systems were no longer good enough, they would careen horizontally and make their way to the ground. This was good enough for Goddard because though they were headed sideways, they were doing so above the speed of sound, which was what he wanted. Unfortunately, there isn't a whole lot of interesting footage associated with these failures. This wasn't exactly a high-budget production in the modern era where everybody has a camera phone, so we're going to move on to the first true space rocket, the V-2. While Werner von Braun did an apprenticeship under Hermann Oberth, The two didn't do very much with liquid fuel or actual launches. Most of what they did were surprisingly dangerous static test fires of solid rocket motors, so we're going to move straight to von Braun's first big achievement. Internally called the A4 due to being the fourth in the series of aggregate rockets, the V2 was employed as a kind of terror weapon by the forces of Nazi Germany in the later portions of the Second World War. It was the first weapon of its kind with the range it had, making it difficult to predict or see coming, and while it didn't necessarily have a high fatality rate, it was very effective at leveling portions of England during its campaign of use and scaring the hell out of everyone. It also had a fairly high failure rate. Let's find out why. In many ways, the technical details of Nazi Germany are a lesson in why crash programs are such a bad idea. With an entire country bent on war, resources quickly become limited. Ball bearings, anyone? And the V2 was no stranger to this aspect of the war. Desperate to roll out what they saw as a vengeance weapon, they cut a lot of corners, preventing the V2 from going through the testing it needed to be truly effective. As it was designed directly from Goddard's plans, it initially struggled to maintain stability at higher altitudes, often veering off course and smashing into the ground at high speeds. It also had the problem of combustion chamber burn-through, which was solved both through regenerative cooling as well as film cooling, which involved injecting a small amount of propellant into the wall of the combustion chamber through small perforations. The combustion chamber was also redesigned to be shorter and tighter, further minimizing burn-through. The stabilizing fins had a tendency to get burned and damaged with altitude as the exhaust plume began to expand, leading to a redesign that gave the fins more clearance. Piping was redesigned to have tension-free curves, preventing them from kinking and causing backup and explosions from high pressure. Exhaust fans similar to Goddard's rockets were fashioned out of graphite to control the trajectory at liftoff. Despite all of this effort, the V2 would have a high failure rate throughout much of its life, mostly due to the circumstances around its production. Far before it was ready, Himmler and the SS demanded V2 production ramp up, which wrenched control of it away from Werner von Braun and into the hands of the SS. Production was moved primarily to the Mittelwerk facility, which used mostly slave labor to produce artillery and rockets for the war effort. As Germany continued to lose the war, materials became more and more subpar, and the state of the workers became more and more desperate. We're talking about very sensitive and highly technical manufacturing, and the people who built it were starved, exhausted, abused, and at constant risk of having their lives taken away. Not exactly your ideal rocket engineers. They made mistakes, not all of them were fully qualified or even trained, and there's evidence that some of them even got a small degree of revenge by sabotaging the work they did. The V2 launch sites were also subpar themselves, suffering poor weather, the constant threat of air raids, and launch operations were hasty with poor quality control. At the end of the day, it's a miracle that the V2 worked at all. Out of a grand total of 3,255, 365 combat V2s failed to reach their target. And the thing is, toward the end of the war, the Germans started to burn everything. If there ever was a detailed record of the V2 test failures, it has been lost to time. All we know is some of the ones that failed, with some of those having an addendum such as guidance failure or exploded on pad. So we went over the general reasons it tended to fail as a rocket, and we'll close out with a nice little collection of Peenemünde footage showing just how bad it got. Now, what came after the V2? Well, this is where rocketry begins to diverge between the two major players, the United States and the Soviet Union. Both had their new toys, captured V2s and the scientists who made them. However, to quote the right stuff, our Germans were better than their Germans. The Americans got the better end of the deal. Von Braun was the brains of the operation and would lead the US Army in repurposing captured V2 rockets for scientific payloads. The Americans would also have similarly mixed success with the primitive German rocket, many suffering engine failures, internal explosions, and degraded performance. However, they would eventually use it as a testbed for their own first large ballistic missile. But, before we cover that, let's hop across the ocean. The Soviet Union had proposed a staged missile as a long-range nuclear payload delivery system as early as 1947, using captured V-2s to reverse engineer the German technology into the RD-107 and RD-108 engines for the R-7 Semyorka, the world's first intercontinental ballistic missile. The R-7 family of rockets would go on to become the core of Soviet and later Russian rocketry, with the modern Soyuz rocket still being flown today. Now, once again, we don't have much footage or detailed information regarding the early R-7's developmental difficulties because, well, Soviet moment, but we can talk about the general problems. The R-7 was an ambitious machine built by a somewhat subpar agency. While the chief designer, Sergei Korolyov, is an undeniable tour de force of pioneering rocketry, the bureau he led, OKB-1, was notorious for poor quality control. If you want evidence of that, just look at how the results of the Venera program changed directly following the takeover of the Lavochkin Bureau. OKB had a lot of assembly and preparation errors throughout their history. For instance, in 1957, an R-7 launch was scrubbed and the rocket returned after its third attempt to launch, and inspections discovered that a nitrogen scavenging valve had been installed backwards. However, admittedly, above and beyond any OKB competence issues was the overwhelming complexity of the brand new rocket and its engine design. The difficulties of managing 4 strap-on boosters alongside a central core frequently led to synchronization and consumption rate issues, which could result in uneven thrust or even premature separation of the stages. The R-7 was quickly found to be a poor weapon. It was expensive, requiring a large remote launch site that was near impossible to hide from spy planes. It took almost 20 hours to prepare for launch, and cryogenic propellants made it impractical to be left on alert and ready to launch for too long. It couldn't be assembled on the pad, instead needing an entire facility and lengthy rollout process that further increased preparation time. Of course, much like von Braun, Sergei Korolyov was a man who saw rockets as a means to an end. If the R-7 wouldn't work as a weapon, perhaps it would work as a space delivery system. A Russian mathematician had already worked out the logistics of putting an artificial satellite into orbit, perhaps even people, and thus begins the space race. An R-7 was modified for early satellite launches and named Molniya, primarily due to launching a large number of Molniya communications satellites. This particular carrier rocket had an impressively poor launch history from 1960 to 1967. Out of 40 total launches, 20 were successful, 9 were total failures, and 11 were partial failures. It suffered many of the same issues as the original R-7. Quality oversights included incorrect soldering of wires, wrong attachments of plugs, and mix-ups in pyrotechnic connectors. Having 2 extra stages meant added complexity, specifically with those upper stages. A common problem with the Molniya Block L was ullage problems. To explain, ullage motors are used during stage separation of upper stages. When the engine of a previous stage cuts off and separates, the rocket briefly enters freefall. As a result, the fuel is also in freefall and ends up sloshing around inside the tanks. When the engine fires, it'll end up encountering gaps in the fuel supply as it moves around, which starves the engine and causes inconsistent thrust or no thrust at all and an early shutdown. Ullage motors were then introduced, very small rocket motors utilizing their own independent fuel supply. These would fire first, the force of them pushing the fuel to the rear of the propellant tanks and therefore toward the engines. This solves the problem of fuel sloshing causing engine starvation, if they work. The problem is, with Molniya they frequently didn't, resulting in engine burns that lasted only a few seconds or never lit at all, leaving payloads either stranded in low orbit or just shy of orbit, where they would inevitably re-enter the atmosphere and be destroyed. Unfortunately, these failures occurred pretty high in the atmosphere and again, Soviet moment, so there isn't exactly any good footage of them. Over on the western side of the equation, the US military started with the Redstone missile, a direct descent into the V-2, designed under the direction of Wernher von Braun. Similar to the early R-7, the high levels of complexity involved resulted in a lot of early failures. However, the Soviets weren't the only ones to keep secrets. Of its first 3 flights, 2 were failures, though there are no photos or videos of either incident thanks to Army secrecy. The first suffered from cavitation of the LOX turbopump, which, true to its name, is used to quickly move propellant into the engine's combustion chamber. To explain cavitation in simple terms, the cryogenic nature of liquid oxygen causes it to boil off at room temperature, which can result in vapor bubbles forming. The bubbles can also be a result of pressure dropping, but either way, it results in inconsistent fuel flow through the turbopump, and therefore bad performance of the engine, often eventually starving it of fuel and causing it to shut down, which is exactly what happened to the Redstone's first flight after 1 minute and 20 seconds. Its second test was successful and its engine was redesigned to prevent the cavitation issue, but its third flight was a total loss. Its main engine cut off 1 second after launch, causing it to fall back onto the pad and explode. Rather famously, Major General Holger Toftoy turned to Wernher von Braun and demanded a cause for the failure. As it had just happened, Von Braun replied that they would need to review the telemetry data to be sure. Toftoy persisted and asked, "Werner, why did the rocket explode?" And Von Braun, frustrated, replied, "It exploded because the damn son of a bitch blew up." After a proper investigation, it was found that there had been a leak in the fuel line. This led to a loss of pressure and therefore a premature shutdown of the engine. Moving forward, Von Braun would press the Army Ballistic Missile Agency to improve reliability and workmanship standards, stating that, quote, "Missile reliability will require that the target area is more dangerous than the launch area," perhaps thinking back to his days with the V2. Over time, the Redstone's failure rate dropped to a point of being referred to as old reliable, and while it would be quickly retired from use as an ICBM due to solid-fueled replacements being much easier to keep at the ready, Redstone derivatives would go on as a space rocket for several years, most notably with the Mercury Redstone launch vehicle. Used for the first suborbital launches of NASA's earliest crewed space program, Project Mercury, the Mercury Redstone rocket had several partial failures throughout its career, with only one complete failure, Mercury Redstone 1, its debut flight. The other partials were mostly due to computer bugs and improper propellant flow regulation, problems that were easily worked out and didn't cause any major failures anyway. But MR1, just have a look at this, the single most visually comical launch failure in the history of rockets. So, just what happened there? Since it goes by so fast, let's go through each action step by step. First, the engine ignites. Less than 1 second later, after the rocket rose approximately 4 inches, hence the nickname of the 4-inch flight, the engine immediately shut down again. Again, within less than a second, the abort tower jettisoned without the capsule, and the rocket settled back onto the pad. A few moments later, the parachute deployed, hanging down uselessly at the side of the rocket. At the end of it all, after NASA had successfully launched an escape tower, the Mercury Redstone launch vehicle was sitting on the pad, completely unsecured, full of fuel, and, for all they knew, entirely active except for its engine. For several minutes, nobody knew what to do. It was quickly deemed too dangerous to approach. Though the engine had shut down, the capsule still had a retro rocket package that could fire at any moment and ignite the fuel in the tanks, as well as range safety destruct charges intended to blow up a wayward rocket if necessary. Just as bad, the deployed parachute hanging at the side of the unsecured rocket threatened to yank the entire thing down to the ground if a strong enough breeze caught it. A few ideas were floated around on what to do, including the excessively American idea of using a rifle to shoot holes in the fuel tanks and depressurize them, eventually leading to what Chris Kraft declared the first rule of flight control. If you don't know what to do, don't do anything. Mission Control decided to simply wait, letting the rocket sit overnight while the liquid oxygen in the tanks slowly boiled off. The next day, it was all gone, and the rocket was deemed safe to approach, take down, and disassemble for study. So, what caused this spectacular failure? A single cable disconnecting in the wrong order. You see, this was back in the days that predated entire rocket launches being performed by a computer. Instead, Mercury Redstone was operated by a series of switches and relays, analog if-then switches. If you're unfamiliar, if-then is a format in computer programming that forces software to make a decision based on pre-existing conditions. For instance, if the Word document has been altered since the last save, then prompt the user to save the document before closing. So, in this case, these switches and relays made decisions such as, if main engine cutoff is reached, then separate the capsule. If over-acceleration is detected, then fire the abort system. However, this single cable screwed up the entire sequence, sort of like a missing semicolon in a line of code. The rocket had been equipped with a power cable and a control cable, with the latter supposed to separate first at liftoff. However, the control cable used was that of a military Redstone missile, which was longer than the one for the Mercury Redstone launch vehicle, causing it to separate first. When it did, this tripped the relay that controlled the engine cutoff. The lack of electrical grounding caused a current flow that sent a normal cutoff signal to the capsule. This would have triggered two events: abort tower jettison, which immediately did occur, and firing of the explosive bolts that held it to the booster. However, a secondary condition hadn't been met for the separation, which required the capsule to be at almost no acceleration before separating to keep a still-moving booster from bumping into it. Because it was sitting on the ground, the capsule registered an acceleration of 1g, and the separation never occurred. The parachute system was then activated by two conditions being met. First, the release of the escape rocket, and then atmospheric pressure sensors that showed the capsule to be below 10,000 feet. The drogue deployed first, then the main, and when the capsule detected that the main parachute was not supporting the capsule's weight, the backup chute was deployed, believing that the main had failed. Thus ends the sequence of events that led to Mercury Redstone 1 believing it had just conducted a completely successful launch. While the suborbital Mercury Redstone only had this one rather spectacular failure, the bigger and orbital Mercury Atlas launch vehicle, also known as Atlas LV-3B, is a slightly different story. Not only did it suffer 2 complete failures, but much like the MRLV was a variant of the military Redstone missile, the LV-3B was adapted from the Atlas ICBM. The Atlas, very much a pioneer among ICBMs, had a rough start. Its first generation, the prototype Atlas A, failed 4 of its 8 flights, most of them caused by short circuits in the guidance system. The second prototype, Atlas B, introduced its distinct stage-and-a-half design, which would drop the 2 booster engines and skirt mid-flight, reaching orbit with a sustainer engine in the middle. This model failed 4 of its 10 test flights, with the most consistent problem being the turbopump. Its early design caused lubricant to foam up at higher altitudes and lower pressure, the loss of lubricant causing the pump to seize up. The pump operated at a speed of around 10,000 RPM, and the centrifugal force would rattle loose the bearings within the pump. Eventually, the turbopumps were replaced by an upgraded version designed by Rocketdyne that had already been developed but not implemented in order to keep the test program from being delayed. The final developmental Atlas, the Atlas C, suffered the most spectacular of all the early failures. On September 24, 1959, Atlas 9C, equipped with the Able upper stage and set to launch the Pioneer P-1 spacecraft, was on the pad for testing. With a dummy payload on board, a static fire was performed to test the launch vehicle. Following a normal engine start, a fire quickly started in the engine section. After 2.5 seconds, the engine shut down, but the fire continued, fed by the liquid oxygen and too intense for pad extinguishers to put out. Ground control could do nothing but watch until 37 seconds after ignition, the rocket tipped over and completely leveled Launch Complex 12, putting it out of use for 6 months. What was the cause? Assembly error. The Atlas C incorporated several changes from the Atlas B, creating small differences in the manufacturing process. The helium tanks to pressurize the vernier thrusters were mounted in a lower location on the Atlas C, and a helium vent valve was accidentally attached in the location it would have been for an Atlas B. This caused helium pressure gas to leak into the RP-1 turbopump, which caused cavitation and therefore pump overspeed and rupture of the low-pressure LOX duct. Thus ended the testing failures of the Atlas. Now let's move on to the operational failures of the Atlas D. While its major issues have been worked out, Atlas continued to be a booster with a reliability of around 76%. Let's talk about a few more notable failures. One unique issue the Atlas had was with tank pressurization. The Atlas D utilized balloon tanks, which lack an internal framework, relying on constant pressurization to maintain their shape. In May of 1963, an Atlas Agena was on the pad with a then-secret payload, the KH-7 reconnaissance satellite. As the booster was being filled with propellant, RP-1, which I mentioned earlier, basically a very refined kerosene, disaster struck when a gas bubble formed in the propellant fill and drain system. This created a hydraulic ram effect, shaking loose the connection where LOX flowed into the upper tank. As the oxidizer drained out, the weight of the upper stage on top put pressure on the booster, and the entire stack collapsed, the booster bending and the upper stage swinging down into the ground. The booster was torn apart and RP-1 spilled everywhere, though shockingly, no fire started. Somebody in the blockhouse clearly thought one was going to. You can see a fire suppression system activate on the left side of the video. Perhaps most shocking, while the Atlas booster and Agena upper stage were obviously a write-off, the payload somehow was not. Details are a little hazy due to the secretive nature of the KH-7, and it may have required a little refurbishing and buffing out of the bumps, but as far as I can tell, the payload we just saw fall to the ground was later launched on a different Atlas Agena successfully. One of the most notable Atlas failures was Atlas Centaur V, which used a new booster derived from the Atlas D, but still kept much of the same function. Before we break down just what happened, let's take a look, as it happened pretty fast. So, what happened? Well, it's all about the prevalves. These are used as a safety and control mechanism, opening to allow propellant flow into the engine and normally remaining open during normal operation, but able to be closed in the event of an engine failure or fuel flow problem. However, in this case, the pre-valves only opened partially, and the force of the propellant flow actually closed them. The engine was then quickly starved of fuel, and a LOX-rich shutdown occurred. With the slow motion footage, we can even see the engine struggling to stay lit as the rocket begins to crash back onto the pad. The fix was also really simple. The Atlas E used manual pre-valves. While there were a couple more notable Atlas failures, Big Joe 1 comes to mind as it was just a non-stop series of tiny disasters the entire flight, we really need to move on from the Atlas era, so we're going to do just that. As always, I encourage people to do their own research and learn more about these rockets and how they work. There's a lot you can learn just by Googling Atlas missile failures. I advise calling it a missile since back in those days, the term rocket and missile were interchangeable. Much like with our next launch vehicle, Titan. The Titan missile began its career as an ICBM, the first multi-stage American ICBM to ever exist. Much like Atlas, the usefulness of Titan as an ICBM was found to be lacking, even though the Titan II used hypergolic propellant that could be safely stored for long periods of time and launched out of a fortified and hidden underground silo. Though it was technically kept as part of the "if you shoot, we'll shoot too" policy of nuclear deterrent up until 1987, Titan IIs and eventually upgraded Titan IIIs, and finally Titan IVs, were a workhorse of the American space program all the way up until 2005. It worked quite reliably too, eventually. First, the problem of pogo oscillation had to be solved. So, what is pogo oscillation, aside from a very fun phrase to say? Well, let me explain what pogo oscillation is. But first I'm going to say it a couple more times. Pogo oscillation. Pogo oscillation. Oscillating my pogos. She oscillate on my... Anyway, engine thrust output isn't exactly uniform. It isn't the exact same constant amount all the time. No engine can do that, not even an electrical engine. There exists what one might call noise, fluctuations in the thrust as the engine fires. Sometimes you get too much noise, and that's when pogo oscillation happens. The engine can get caught in a vicious feedback loop, beginning with a surge in pressure to the combustion chamber. This increases back pressure and reduces fuel flow, which in turn reduces chamber pressure. The reduced chamber pressure then causes the back pressure to reduce, which causes another surge in pressure to the combustion chamber. Rinse and repeat. This cycle of pulsing instability can, in the right rhythms, cause the rocket to quite literally bounce along its longitudinal axis like a pogo stick. This kind of vibration can damage the internal components, compromise the overall structure, and in the worst cases, completely tear the rocket apart. Pogo oscillation was a big problem for the Titan II during its development. Interestingly, the rocket was robust enough that this didn't particularly affect it as an ICBM. However, if you want to put people on it, you have a problem, and the Titan II was already being adapted for the Gemini program. The problem of pogo significantly delayed rating the Titan II for human use, and was slowly mitigated through a series of fixes that more or less solved the issue, at least for that rocket. The fixes ranged from a helium injection system in the LOX line which dampened fluctuations, to the use of accumulators designed to absorb the fluctuations, to more precise throttle valves, to just plain making the whole rocket sturdier to survive it. No fix was 100% perfect, but by 1964, the Titan II was considered safe and stable enough to be the launch platform for the Gemini program, and it worked flawlessly for all 12 flights. Before we move on to that other famous oscillating rocket, we need to talk about one more Titan failure, a rather famous one. This occurred with the Titan I, not the Titan II, in 1959. As we did previously, let's just watch the video first, rendered here in very high definition from the original 36mm film from the channel Atom Central. God, I love film quality. So what happened there? MR1 made it further than that. Well, according to the source I found, the range safety charge ruptured the fuel tank. How exactly? I'm not sure because a full-on range safety detonation should have completely destroyed the rocket. However, either way, with the ruptured fuel tank, the first stage quickly collapsed and the second stage fell onto the pad. What was the fix? Who knows? Thank you, Army Secrecy. Appreciate you. Now, one other rocket is particularly noteworthy for its problems with pogo oscillation, the mighty Saturn V. Launched 13 times, 12 of which were in service of the Apollo lunar program, the Saturn V remains an unmatched, monstrous powerhouse of a rocket, even in the current era of Starship working on surpassing its achievements. Over its history, it never experienced a full failure, and completed every mission it set out to do, mostly. However, quite frankly, NASA got lucky with this beast. Several flights experienced a number of issues. Even its final flight, the launch of Skylab, suffered quite a few, but the most notable was Apollo 6, the only mission to have been deemed officially a partial failure. Oscillations on this flight caused so much thrust instability that the vehicle exceeded the maximum amount of Gs that it was designed for, and despite this, suffered no serious damage during its first stage burn despite being able to see pieces falling off of the rocket. However, the pogo problem re-emerged with the J2 engines on the second stage, shutting down 2 of them during their burn, though it was able to compensate by burning the remaining 3 for longer, as well as burning the third stage a little extra. After reaching orbit, the intention was to demonstrate the third stage relight for translunar injection, but the engine wouldn't relight. Without this, the command and service module wasn't able to raise its orbit high enough to simulate re-entry speeds from the moon, thus re-entering at a much lower speed than intended. All of these factors combined to make up the only technical failure of the Saturn V. Fixing pogo this time around came with a similar approach as it had with Titan. Small, incremental fixes over time, mostly after Apollo 6 made it a clear and serious issue. The same helium injection and gas accumulator fixes were implemented, as well as modifications to the J2 engines to simplify their propellant flow, including addition of baffle zones in the injector plate to split the combustion up into different zones, further stabilizing the engine. Technically, the problem of pogo with the Saturn V was never fully solved. It was a ghost that chased the rocket for its entire lifetime, mitigated but never fully put to rest. But what about the Soviets? Well, their answer to the Saturn V was the N1. The Soviet lunar program was a complicated beast that would require a full video to explain, someday, but today we're just going to explain the 4 test flights of the super heavy lift N1, all of which ended in spectacular failure. The N1's first stage utilized an unprecedented 30 NK-15 engines, and at the time, this was a very difficult beast to manage. Not that it can't ever be mastered, we'll come back to that, but in the 1960s, the complex plumbing and management of these particular 30 engines were a true struggle, and the limited budget of the program prevented a more exhaustive testing campaign. The NK-15 engines utilized pyrotechnic valves that, once closed, could not be reopened, making them a one-shot deal. They couldn't be tested as a cohesive unit, and in fact, only 2 out of every 6 engines built were tested, and those 2 were never actually used on a booster. Furthermore, the Cord system, a computer program used to manage the engines in flight, was primitive and slow by modern standards. It was designed to manage control of the engines. They couldn't gimbal to steer the rocket, instead using differential thrust. If it wanted to turn left, it would lower the thrust of the engines on the right side. It also managed malfunctions. If an engine was having problems, Cord would shut it down, and then to keep the thrust symmetrical, would shut down the corresponding engine on the opposite side, with the rocket capable of having a total of 4 engines shut down before its overall thrust began to become compromised. In February of 1969, the first N1 rolled to the pad, carrying a Soyuz Zond spacecraft intended for an uncrewed lunar flyby. Almost immediately after liftoff, one engine, and therefore a second, was shut down due to a transient voltage, which is basically an unwanted surge in electrical power. A few seconds later, a familiar face reared its ugly head, pogo oscillation, shaking the rocket into losing several components of a third engine, which started a propellant leak. Shockingly, the rocket kept going, but just under 30 seconds into the launch, more pogo caused propellant to spill into the rear of the booster, which started a fire. Wires burned through, causing more transient voltages that forced Cord to shut down the entire booster at T plus 68 seconds. The rocket then plummeted into the Kazakhstan desert, 52 kilometers from the launch pad. The second N1 was the most disastrous flight. In fact, it's one of the most disastrous rocket launches of all time. Brought to the pad in July of 1969, it carried another Zond spacecraft intended for lunar orbit and possible photography of potential landing sites. It launched late at night, rose just clear of its launch tower, and then an explosion was seen at its base, sending debris falling down. Every single engine, save for one, shut down immediately. The rocket fell back to the pad, tilting due to the one remaining engine, and crashed back onto the pad, with almost all of its fuel still on board. The resultant explosion shattered every window in the launch complex, sent debris flying 10 kilometers away, and leveled the entire launch pad. Shockingly, this blast was far less intense than it could have been. When investigators arrived around 30 minutes later, they found they were being rained on by droplets of unburnt propellant. In fact, 85% of the onboard propellant had not detonated, as this required a mixing process of the kerosene and LOX to form an explosive gel, and this miraculously had not happened. Investigations found that the turbo pump in one engine had exploded, and the shockwave of that explosion destroyed several fuel lines and started fires all over the bottom of the booster. Wiring burned and cord was sent signals of abnormal pressure and pump speeds, leading it to shut down several engines one after the other, and then eventually all of them. The one engine that remained firing wasn't supposed to, and it was never determined exactly why it did. While the launch complex was still being cleaned up and repaired, the space race effectively ended when Apollo 11 launched later that month. Another N1 wouldn't launch until June of 1971, carrying a dummy Soyuz 7K-LOK spacecraft somewhat equivalent to an Apollo CSM. Soon after liftoff, the rocket started to roll. Cord tried to shut it down, but modifications had been made since the second launch, preventing a shutdown for the first 50 seconds to allow the vehicle to clear the pad. Before this could happen, the uncontrolled roll put the vehicle into gimbal lock, preventing the inertial guidance unit from steering it. Not that the engines could gimbal, but the IMU could. At T plus 48 seconds, the second and third stages ripped away from each other, and the first stage engine shut down a moment later. The last N1 would launch in November of 1972 and made it the furthest. Also carrying a dummy spacecraft, the launch proceeded nominally until right before stage separation. The center engines performed a planned shutdown to reduce stress on the vehicle, but doing so proved to be disastrous. The shutdown created a hydraulic shockwave, bursting propellant lines and starting a fire and causing an explosion of one engine. The launch escape system activated and the first stage disintegrated, ejecting the other two stages before they crashed into the step. Investigation after the fact revealed that the hydraulic shockwave disrupted the flow of fuel in the lines of the still-hot engines, rupturing the lines and spilling fuel, which started a fire. This was the final fate of the N1, having never made it to space, and never even made it to stage separation. Before we move past this point in time, I want to talk about one other Soviet failure. While not technically a space rocket but an ICBM, the two are intrinsically linked, as should be obvious at this point. Furthermore, this particular ICBM was developed in an attempt to compete with the R-7 and was a sticking point for the argument between storable hypergolic propellants and trickier but more efficient cryogenic ones. In 1960, a prototype R-16 ICBM was being prepared for final tests before launch from Baikonur Cosmodrome. Chief Marshal of Artillery Mitrofan Nedelin, in charge of R-16 development, had put a lot of pressure on the team to achieve a launch before the 1960 anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, a difficult thing to achieve in an era of pioneering brand new engineering challenges. Pre-launch checks and final testing began to overlap in this tightly squeezed schedule, and with hundreds of people present at the launch complex, many of them very, very close to the rocket, disaster struck. A short circuit caused the second stage engine to suddenly ignite, firing down into the first stage fuel tanks and detonating them. A massive explosion rocked the launch complex. Nedelin and around 70 others were instantly incinerated. Hundreds of others, it's difficult to say how many as extreme secrecy was imposed for a long time, were severely burned. Nikita Khrushchev buried the incident, putting out a statement that Nedelin had died in a plane crash, and questioned missile designer Mikhail Yangel as to why he was still alive. Reportedly, Yangel broke down in tears, stating that he had walked away behind a bunker to smoke a cigarette and that it, quote, was all my fault. The Nedelin catastrophe, as it is now known, remains the deadliest incident in the history of rocketry, and it is a good lesson on why such things simply cannot be rushed. An overwatered, over-fertilized plant can still die, to badly paraphrase a quote by Wernher von Braun. Now, following the Apollo era, the focus of NASA, and therefore the launch vehicles they used, would change dramatically. We're headed toward the era of the space shuttle, the quest for reusability, and the endless need to lower costs in an era of more widely distributed budgets. However, we need to go back in time for a couple of other rockets because they're notable, but I just couldn't find anywhere to put them. So, first things first, we need to talk about Vanguard. Project Vanguard was one of the original Big Three. When Eisenhower first announced that the United States would launch an artificial satellite, followed closely by the Soviet announcement that they would do the same, three organizations wanted the prestige of launching that satellite: the Navy, the Air Force, and the Army. While the latter of the three, led by Wernher von Braun and his Redstone-derived Juno 1 rocket, would eventually win out and launch Explorer 1, they weren't actually the first choice. The Air Force came in last, as their project was the Atlas missile and it was far from ready, but the first choice was actually the Navy, who were developing the Vanguard rocket. While the Army's proposal was the most realistic and achievable, Eisenhower wanted to paint a civilian face on the first US satellite project, and Vanguard was the most civilian booster they had, as it was the only one not developed for a military missile program. So Vanguard it was, with the TV-3 satellite on the pad in early December of 1957, just 2 months after the launch of Sputnik 1. Let's take a look at how it went, huh?
There were a number of failures during the year, and the United States promptly announced them. The first and most spectacular of these was Vanguard at the end of 1957. There were other Vanguard failures. All achieved takeoff, but trouble occurred either in the second or third stages.
Yeah, not great. Now before we get into what happened, let me tell you my favorite thing about this failure to launch, affectionately referred to by many as Stayputnik or Kaputnik. After the dust had settled and the cleanup had begun, Mission Control realized that they could hear something. They were receiving a transmission from the TV-3 satellite, which had been flung from the rocket and was lying on the ground nearby. It still worked. It was deemed to be not fit enough for another launch, but it was transmitting, and that's pretty impressive when you see the blast it got thrown away from. So, what happened? Well, aside from the obvious fact that the booster lost thrust just a few feet off the pad and fell back down to the tune of ruptured fuel tanks, we don't exactly know. Back in those days, the Navy had limited instruments with which to record telemetry data, and the exact cause was never confirmed through examination of the debris. Martin Marietta, prime contractor for the satellite itself, concluded the following. Fuel that had already ignited leaked through the combustion chamber into the injector, causing low pressure in the turbopump and a failure of the engine. General Electric, however, who were responsible for the booster's first stage, maintained that all of the problems were a result of nothing more than a loose fuel connection. After a thorough investigation, it seemed to be a combination of both. Low fuel system pressure in the injector head caused a propellant backup and subsequent spike, creating a shockwave in the thrust section that ruptured a fuel line and killed all thrust to the engine. It was a serious design oversight that was corrected for the next launch, though Explorer 1 would be ready via the Army's Juno 1 rocket before a successful Vanguard launch could ever be seen. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, and subsequently Russia, had only one other operational rocket of note, which had a particularly high failure rate early in its lifetime, the Proton heavy lift vehicle. Derived from an intended heavy ICBM, the first model, Proton K, had a rushed development phase and frequent early failures with varied causes. Ranging from improperly installed components to poor scheduling of the launch sequence, Proton's early days were kind of disastrous, eventually leading to a 1970 investigation into its high failure rate. After serious redesigns, its reliability was improved, but remained around only 90% successful until it was retired in 2012. Again, the reasons varied, with many occurring in the Block D upper stages, shaken into a messy state by the first stage or suffering problems difficult to determine so late into the flight. Overall, however, Proton was deemed safe enough to launch the Salyut and Almaz space stations, most components of Mir, and 2 key modules of the International Space Station. Now, I would be remiss if I somehow didn't talk about one specific Proton failure that occurred in 2013, considered by many to rival the comedic value of Mercury Redstone 1. This one isn't as visually comical, but wait until you find out just why this happened. Let's watch. So, rockets have these things called IMUs, or inertial measurement units. These are guidance systems composed of several components, usually a combination of accelerometers, gyroscopes, and sometimes magnetometers. In this particular case, the Proton's accelerometers have been installed upside down. As a result, the rocket believed that up was down and down was up, and tried to flip itself over, hence the wavering action before it simply lost control altogether. But wait, it gets better. The location in which the accelerometers were installed had arrows indicating which direction they should be facing, and these were either missed or ignored by the technician. But wait, it gets better. The mounting plates required pins to mount the accelerometers that only worked in one direction, meaning that the technician forcefully hammered them in, brute forcing past the requirements of the pins to put them into place. Needless to say, it's safe to assume that someone was fired after this incident that destroyed a $65 million launch vehicle and its payload of a GLONASS navigation satellite. In the same vein as this most famous Proton failure, it's also probably worth mentioning Intelsat 708. I won't go into too much detail because I already made a much more detailed video about this, and the more interesting part isn't the failure, but the aftermath. Either way, Intelsat 708 was the failure of a Chinese Long March 3B rocket, a rocket I happen to own a model of that was purchased directly from the Jiuquan Launch Center, which ironically never actually saw the launch of a 3B, and it failed in a very similar way. Its guidance unit failed in a somewhat unspecified manner, thank you Chinese space program, and the result was visually pretty similar. Apologies in advance for the low quality video and audio. The difference here is that the Zhejiang Launch Center is surrounded by populated villages, causing a significant controversy when the rocket crashed outside of one and completely leveled it. The Chinese government claims that the village had been evacuated beforehand, but there is some level of dispute to this claim. Either way, not good. Now, the Space Shuttle. What a can of worms. Over 30 years and 135 flights, there is a lot that can be said about the Space Shuttle in regards to the subject of failures. They can and eventually will be their own videos. I love the Space Shuttle and always will. It was so incredibly ambitious, multifaceted, and had capabilities that we still haven't been able to match with a single vehicle. At the same time, it was a flawed launch system that should have been vastly changed over the course of its lifetime, and to be honest, shouldn't have even ended up in the compromised state of its final design. What this means is, it had a lot more close calls and near misses than the two that are most remembered. And the unfortunate reality is, when you have a vehicle that always carries crew and is capable of carrying 7 of them, a feat still unmatched by any other vehicle, when it goes wrong, it goes very wrong. We'll start with the worst of the worst, but there are some other things to cover too. First things first, January 28th, 1986. The Space Shuttle is on the pad for the 25th shuttle mission and the 10th flight of Shuttle Challenger. On board, Richard Scobie, Michael Smith, Ellison Onizuka, Judith Resnick, Gregory Jarvis, and Krista McAuliffe, a civilian teacher. Frankly, everyone's seen the footage repeatedly, and if you haven't, you can easily look it up, so I'm not going to directly show it today. Most of us know the basics. 78 seconds into ascent, Shuttle Challenger abruptly disintegrated, both solid rocket boosters breaking away and careening wildly through the air, and all 7 crew members were killed.
3 at 65.
65, Fido.
TDL confirms throttles.
Thank you.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
Fido trajectory. Go ahead.
The picture you were just seeing was Christy McAuliffe's parents watching in horror. These are the students from her school.
Some may even be aware of the darker part that the crew cabin survived the breakup and fell into the ocean a minute or two later, and the crew appear to have been alive and conscious for that until impact with the water at a speed of around 200 miles an hour. So, what exactly happened? Well, there's a lot of indirect reasons for the Challenger failure. From warnings by engineers that were passed over, to political pressure to keep shuttle launch cadence up, to desire by NASA to use the shuttle to make spaceflight seem routine and accessible, to enough things to write an entire book about. It's called Truth, Lies, and O-Rings, and I highly recommend it. But what we're here to talk about today is the technical reason for Challenger's failure. Let's talk about O-Rings. The Space Shuttle's twin solid rocket boosters made use of a process called extrusion, something discovered during the testing process that was then incorporated into the intended procedure. When the boosters ignited, their casing would balloon outwards from the stress of ignition. This would create a gap between the casings through which hot gases could leak and put strain on the overall structure of the orbiter. However, it was discovered that the large rubber O-rings used to seal these joints would, when exposed to enough of those hot gases, erode away enough that they would shift out of their groove and seal these gaps in the casing. However, this extrusion process has its limitations, the primary one being temperature. Below certain temperatures, the O-rings get too cold, take too long to heat up and erode, and fail to do their job, which is precisely what happened here. At around 58 seconds, a bright plume can be seen at the aft attached strut on the right SRB, a result of the extrusion process failing and the gases escaping through the gaps of the casing. This plume burned into the hydrogen tank of the external fuel tank, causing a drop in pressure. The main engines pivoted to compensate for the changing thrust balance, and the right SRB pulled away from the aft strut that held it in place. It swung around and slammed into the intertank structure, immediately destroying it and pushing the entire stack in a lateral direction. Unable to handle the aerodynamic force, the orbiter was torn to pieces and the two SRBs broke free, still firing, careening through the air until range safety ordered them to be destroyed at T+110 seconds. The aftermath of the Challenger disaster was a complete crippling of the remaining shuttle program. Dozens and dozens of sub-programs were cancelled as a direct result of it. The Shuttle Centaur program, polar launches from Vandenberg Slick 6, the Manned Maneuvering Unit, the High Launch Cadence, and more were all cut. The Rogers Commission, formed to investigate the incident, was critical both of the design of the boosters as well as the risk assessment procedures of both NASA and Morton Thiokol, who designed the boosters. It concluded that NASA lacked a culture of safety and the management structure was insufficient to properly account for potential flight issues. An independently observed redesign of the SRBs, now called the Redesigned Solid Rocket Boosters or RSRBs, was conducted, including a capture feature to prevent joint rotation, extra O-rings, small heaters to maintain consistent temperature around the O-rings, and more. New procedures were developed for bailing out of the orbiter during the glide phase, numerous hardware changes were made to the aerodynamic structure and main engines, and software changes made to the launch, re-entry, and landing procedures. However, despite all of the effort made by the Rogers Commission and NASA in the wake of this truly horrific disaster, another occurred before the program was out, and in fact hastened its demise. In 2003, Space Shuttle Columbia set off on STS-107, the 113th flight of the program, and the 28th flight of the first spaceworthy orbiter. The launch was nominal, or at least appeared nominal on the surface. However, when the orbiter made its re-entry into Earth's atmosphere, something went horribly wrong, the vehicle disintegrated, and scattered across 2 different US states, once again killing all 7 crew members: Rick Husband, William McCool, Michael Anderson, Kalpana Chawla, Laurel Clark, David Brown, and Ilan Roman. The breakup wasn't a complete surprise. During launch, Columbia experienced an event that, at the time, was deemed a quote, reuse issue, meaning the shuttle would be fine for this mission, but extensive refurbishment would be needed before the next flight. A foam strike. Similar events had happened before, actually with surprising frequency, on 65 out of 79 flights that had available imagery to see them happen. The foam came from the spray-on insulation for the external fuel tank, which, after being sprayed on, was hand-carved to help with aerodynamics. The specific piece that broke off on STS-107 was the left bipod ramp, which connected the orbiter's front underside to the tank. This same piece had broken off and struck the orbiter on STS-7, STS-32, and STS-50, after which it was deemed an accepted flight risk, despite modifications to help hold it in place. The debris was about the size of a suitcase, and on STS-107 struck the orbiter at a speed of around 400 miles per hour, impacting the reinforced carbon-carbon panels on the leading edge of the left wing. Post-launch analysis of the available video didn't provide any views of the damage to the wing, and technicians attempted to simulate the incident from the ground to get an idea of how bad it might be. One analysis by Boeing indicated that the orbiter's aluminum skin would be exposed in the impact zone, as the foam may have hit deeper than the thickness of the TPS tiles. Overestimations of damage in the past caused NASA to dismiss this claim. Members of the assessment team made multiple attempts to request images of the orbiter while it was performing its mission, channeled through the Department of Defense. The requests were then canceled by Linda Ham, chair of the NASA Mission Management Team, because they, quote, weren't made through the proper channels. She also dismissed the DoD's abilities to image the orbiter as sufficient for damage assessment, and also noted that the orbiter would have to change its orientation to obtain the images, which would disrupt the flow of work being done aboard. When Columbia re-entered the atmosphere on February 1st, the damage to the wing allowed hot gases from the re-entry to seep into the wing structure and melt the aluminum. 4.5 minutes into the re-entry, a sensor system similar to a black box recorded a higher than normal amount of strain on the wing, though this information was not relayed to the crew or mission control. It wasn't meant to be. Observers watching the shuttle re-enter from the ground saw pieces of it falling off, though this was also something both the crew and mission control were unaware of. The crew did eventually become aware of a loss of pressure in one of the landing gear tire sets. When communications were lost with the crew, it wasn't immediately clear that something had gone wrong, as loss of communication during re-entry was very common. However, minutes later, reports from the ground came in that the orbiter had been seen to disintegrate completely, and mission control entered contingency mode.
GC flight. GC flight. Flight GC, lock the doors. Copy.
The Columbia Accident Investigation Board found that in the nearly 2 decades since the Challenger disaster, many of the same problems had cropped up again. A lack of safety culture, a lack of appropriate channels for risk assessment, and pressure to adhere to a schedule for the assembly of the International Space Station. The board also extensively discussed rescue possibilities for the crew, some of which are dubious, such as on-orbit repairs, but none of this could have happened without NASA first having taken the problem seriously at all. Improvements were again made to the launch system, including removal of foam from critical areas, replacing them with heaters to mitigate ice buildup, adding more cameras both to the orbiters and the ground systems, and a sensor system was added to the Canadarm to allow for examination on orbit. Missions to the ISS would include a flip maneuver to allow station astronauts to examine the orbiter's status upon arrival, and emergency rescue missions were scheduled and brought to the pad to accompany every remaining shuttle mission. Now, we've gotten through the 2 big ones, but now it's time to talk about the near misses. Since this is beginning to drag on, I'll only bring up 2, but if you want more, I talked pretty extensively about some in my Space Shuttle Iceberg video. But for now, we'll talk about STS-27. Launched in 1988 on a classified DoD mission, Atlantis suffered an incident during ascent that was eerily similar to Columbia's final flight. A piece of SRB nose cap broke off and struck the underside of the vehicle. They took a look at it in flight, but the camera mounted on Canadarm at the time had limited resolution and they couldn't really tell how bad it was. They tried to send the images back to ground control but were required to use encrypted DoD channels that reduced the image quality, making it hard for them to determine the damage as well. So much so that ground control actually dismissed the damage as, quote, lights and shadows. The crew became frustrated and concerned about their safety on re-entry. It got so bad, in fact, that Commander Robert Gibson stated that if things looked like they were going to go south during re-entry, he planned to get on the radio and tell Mission Control, quote, what he thought of their analysis in the moments before his death. After the shuttle landed, the extent of the damage became clear. Over 700 thermal protection tiles were damaged, and one was missing altogether. Thankfully, the missing tile was located over a steel mounting plate for an S-band antenna, which absorbed the heat of re-entry and prevented a burn-through of the orbiter's hull. Man, who could have predicted that steel would be such a good material for enduring atmospheric re-entry? Crazy. Anyway, let's talk about the golden bullet that nearly caused a serious catastrophe. STS-93, during which Shuttle Columbia launched the Chandra X-ray Observatory, launched in July of 1999. When the engines fired, they dislodged something, a golden retaining pin that was used to plug an oxidizer post in one of the engines, sending it hurtling into the inner wall of the nozzle at supersonic speeds. The impact tore open 3 tubes through which hydrogen fuel was being circulated for regenerative cooling purposes, and the fuel began to leak. Shockingly, this did not trigger a redundant set launch sequencer abort, and the shuttle lifted off as normal. Then, 5 seconds later, an electrical short caused one of the engine's control units to shut down, though the other redundant control units were able to compensate. It was a very near miss, mostly attributable to the absurd complexity of the SSME engine and the shuttle's systems in general.
Liftoff confirmed. Copy liftoff. All up, 3104.
In the roll, we've got
Flag, lost controller, lost D2A on the center, D2B on the left. Got AC bus sensors off, no action on the other 2 AC.
Flight booster lost control redundancy, lost center engine A, right engine B looks like something on AC1.
Copy that.
AC bus sensors off.
AC bus
the other
sensors off.
two. Columbia, Houston, we'd like AC bus sensors off.
Eagle flight?
In the fuel cell.
Flight, we're looking like a transient on a...
In the 1990s, the word of the day surrounding spaceflight was cheap. There was an ever-increasing demand to lower launch costs, lower spacecraft costs, and do what had been done on a fraction of the budget. My videos regarding the exploration of Mars and Venus cover the spacecraft failures pretty well, but there were a lot of corner-cutting measures regarding rockets as well. Let's take a look at the biggest booms of the 1990s, starting with everyone's favorite anomaly.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. We have ignition and liftoff from Cape Canaveral Air Station of the Air Force Delta II launch vehicle carrying the new GPS-2R satellite. We have had an anomaly. We just had an anomaly of the Delta II launch vehicle from Cape Canaveral Air Station.
That was fast, occurring only 13 seconds into launch and being the lowest altitude rocket explosion since Atlas Centaur in 1965. This was the flight of GPS-2R1 in 1997 aboard a Delta II. 250 tons of debris fell around the launch complex, starting a small fire and severely damaging 20 cars in a parking lot. Thankfully, nobody was harmed. So, what happened? A crack formed in the casing of one of the solid rocket boosters at T+6 seconds and got worse as the flight progressed. The casing ruptured and came loose, striking the booster next to it and causing both to fail. Exactly 1 second later, the range safety system automatically called it a day, detonating and destroying the rocket at an altitude of 1,610 feet. The damage to the booster casing was caused in transit by a new system for moving the boosters around, and revisions were made afterwards to prevent a repeat failure. In fact, this was the only full failure of a Delta II out of 155 flights, with a partial failure occurring when a booster failed to separate, which didn't prevent the vehicle from reaching orbit. Now, let's hop across the pond, shall we? Ariane 5 was a fairly well-known and respected heavy lift vehicle for nearly 20 years, the flagship launch vehicle of the European Space Agency. However, its maiden voyage in 1996 did not quite go as planned and had people worried about the future of such a promising vehicle. Let's watch.
9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, unité, feu. Allumage. Décollage. Tous les paramètres propulsifs sont normaux et la trajectoire est normale.
So what happened there? It all seemed so smooth, no major visible issues, it just seemed to suddenly lose control. Well, it did. The entire inertial measurement unit locked up, causing the rocket to immediately lose control. And what locked up the IMU? Bad code. This is a really embarrassing one, to be honest. In one of those cost-saving measures I talked about earlier, Ariane 5 reused software and programming code from Ariane 4. The early part of Ariane 5's flight path had completely different values from its predecessor, which caused a calculation of its horizontal bias to be unexpectedly high. So high, in fact, that the code couldn't even account for it, creating an overflow exception. This is similar to the old Pac-Man kill screen. The game uses a single byte to store the level number, meaning it can only go from 0 to 255. As a result, when it reaches 256, there is an integer overflow and the game breaks completely. Something similar happened here. When the overflow happened, the flight computer was presented with garbage data, which it tried to interpret as a flight path, moving the vehicle's nozzles to steer it. The angle of attack increased beyond a point it could handle at those speeds, which caused the boosters to separate and the flight termination system to immediately activate, destroying the entire stack. Ariane 5 would go on to become a fairly reliable rocket, enough so that it was chosen to launch the absurdly delicate, complicated, and expensive affair that is the James Webb Space Telescope, which it performed flawlessly. The Antares rocket, first flown in 2013, is something of a workhorse for NASA and Northrop Grumman, though it was originally manufactured by Orbital Sciences and then Orbital ATK. It also makes use of heavy cost-saving measures, leveraging low-cost, off-the-shelf, and second-hand parts and designs. Antares is mostly known for launching the Cygnus cargo spacecraft to the ISS, replacing supply deliveries from the Space Shuttle and supplementing those from Russian Progress spacecraft following the retirement of the shuttle in 2011. Antares has been a reliable rocket for quite a long time, except for its fourth flight in 2014, carrying a Cygnus named after Deke Slayton, one of the original Mercury 7 astronauts. Get your popcorn, everybody.
4, 3, 2, 1. And we have liftoff of Antares with the orbital 3 missions that brings Cygnus on its third CRS mission to the ISS. Got main engines at 108%.
Avionics power nominal.
And launch team, be advised, stay at your consoles. Everyone in the LCC, maintain your positions in your consoles. In the LCC, maintain positions at your console.
So, what happened? Funny thing, don't know. Investigation revealed that a LOX turbopump exploded, which severed propellant lines and gradually shut down the AJ-26 engines, which were refurbished from Russian NK-33 engines. However, why the LOX turbopump failed isn't exactly known. The next Antares that flew used completely redesigned engines, export versions of the Russian RD-191, thus the exact same problem never cropped up again. It remains something of a mystery, and the only failure of any Antares launch to date. In 2001, a new private spaceflight company was founded, acquiring experienced employees and creating plans for a small lift launch vehicle that could further lower costs of taking things to orbit. It started slowly, developing its first rocket in 2008 that failed 3 times in a row, nearly ending the company. After a 4th successful attempt, things began to turn around when the company was awarded a commercial resupply contract from NASA, which would require a bigger rocket. That was when SpaceX started to develop the Falcon 9. Their first rocket, the Falcon 1, failed for various reasons. The first was due to a fuel line leak believed to be caused by corrosion from saltwater spray off the coast. They implemented a solution involving replacing some parts with steel rather than aluminum. Shockingly, this was the cheaper option, but aluminum had originally been chosen for weight reduction. The second launch made it through its first stage burn, but during staging, the second stage engine bell was bumped by the first stage, and while this didn't appear to cause any damage, the second stage shut down early due to overcorrection of an oscillation that was increased by the earlier impact. SpaceX considered the flight to be a 95% success, believing just a few small changes could perfect the system. However, the issue cropped up again on Flight 3, the 2 stages bumping together after separation, causing the same failure to occur again, though SpaceX believed Flight 4 would be successful if they simply increased the amount of time between main engine cutoff and stage separation. They turned out to be right, assembling the 4th rocket out of available parts in a last-ditch effort to save the company that paid off completely. Falcon 9 development went much more smoothly, for the most part. At the very least, successful deliveries of payloads to orbit were commonplace, supplementing the company's cash flow with continuous new contracts under the promise that they could perfect the reusability aspects of the first stage. This part was a lengthy, complicated process detailed exceptionally well in SpaceX's own video titled How Not to Land an Orbital Rocket Booster, which I can't play because the music is copyrighted. However, here's a quick handful of landing failures and their reasons. The first drone ship landing attempt failed due to the grid fins that steer the rocket running out of hydraulic fluid, causing it to crash hard into the ship. The second attempt landed, but tipped over due to a stuck throttle valve that caused the engine to keep firing for an instant too long. CRS-7 was Falcon 9's first major in-flight failure, disintegrating about 139 seconds into flight. A strut securing a high-pressure helium bottle inside the LOX tank had failed, causing helium to flood into the tank and making it overpressurize and burst. There were further failures of booster landing. One failed to lock one of its landing legs and tipped over, another failed due to low fuel reserves, one ran out of propellant just above the ship and slammed down hard, and then there was Amos 6. Amos 6 was an Israeli communications satellite intended to be launched on the 29th flight of Falcon 9 in 2016. However, while the rocket was on the pad being filled with fuel for a static fire, this happened. Within 2 months, SpaceX announced that they had identified the problem and that it was, quote, straightforwardly fixable, later explaining that a buckled liner in a pressure vessel within the LOX tank had ruptured. This would be the most recent on-the-pad or even near-the-pad failure of any rocket at Cape Canaveral. Falcon 9 has gone on to become a true game-changer, pioneering a form of first-stage reuse believed to be impossible to make viable for a long time. Yes, I know the Delta Clipper existed, but there's a reason it's not operating today, isn't there? Falcon 9 has achieved a cadence and reliability rate matched only by Soyuz while operating for around a fifth of the time of Soyuz. It had an extremely impressive series of successful launches and landings, only broken within the last year by one failed booster landing and one upper stage LOX leak that caused the failure of a Starlink deployment. Otherwise, Falcon 9 has spent the last decade being an impressive, unmatched workhorse with no end in sight, until, perhaps, Starship enters operation. I'm exaggerating a little bit, the two rockets perform vastly different functions, but before we get to Starship, we have to talk about the Smallsat Hunger Games. With the success of SpaceX came a burst of new private spaceflight companies, several of them wanting to capitalize on an untapped satellite launch market, primarily the need for the ability to launch small satellites at a reasonable price. Falcon 9 is great, but if all you have to launch is a CubeSat for a university, it's kind of overkill and not worth the cost unless you're ride-sharing with a dozen other CubeSats. So along came Firefly Aerospace, Astra, Relativity Aerospace, Rocket Lab, and several others. Many of these companies were founded before SpaceX truly hit its stride, Rocket Lab in 2006 for example, but they all had the same goal. The small-sat launch market was soon saturated and an inevitability was on the horizon. Those of us watching these cosmic Olympic Games saw it coming. Some of these companies were not going to make it, and we were just waiting for the cannon to fire. First up, or so we thought since it's apparently an unkillable Hydra, was Astra. Astra's rocket, named Rocket, was designed to be manufactured at minimal cost, employ simple materials and techniques, be launched by a very small team, as well as be transported to the pad in a standard-sized shipping container. Astra operated the vehicle at a Pacific Spaceport Complex, Alaska on Kodiak Island. Out of 9 Astra rocket launches, you can't hear it but I'm saying rocket with a capital R, what a horrible name, 7 were failures, and for a while the company was in limbo. It was believed they would inevitably dissolve, but still haven't, and even plan to have a 4th generation rocket that they state that they can achieve a weekly cadence with. However, we're here to talk about failures, and Rocket 3.3 had possibly the most amusing one ever aside from MR1 or the Proton flip, what we affectionately refer to as the Astra Power Slide. Observe.
Motion.
Remarkably, the rocket made an attempted recovery, beginning to ascend in the right direction, though it was well beyond its allowable trajectory. It had burned for too long and too far to reach its target, and was destroyed 2 minutes and 28 seconds after launch. The power slide was caused by a propellant leak that caused an explosion, disabling one of the 5 engines and playing hell with the guidance system as it tried to establish a nominal trajectory. By the time it did, far too much fuel had been lost, and it was too late. The next launch also had a rather fascinating failure. Astra's rocket uses a somewhat unique staging system in which the upper stage is housed within a clamshell fairing which opens up to allow for release and upper stage ignition. However, on this flight, the fairing didn't open. The second stage separated, drifted forward into the closed fairing, and ignited its engine, punching through and spinning wildly out of control. Shortly afterward, the flight was terminated, and it was found that an error in the wiring diagram prevented the fairing from opening correctly. Firefly Aerospace developed its own small lift launcher, Firefly Alpha, with a debut flight in September of 2021. However, we already saw that this didn't go very well. This isn't unusual. I think we've seen by now that very few launch vehicles succeed on their very first flight, but for a newer company trying to make their way into an expensive and competitive market, early failures are difficult to navigate when it comes to handling investors and contract writers and anyone else who might be involved with the financial side of things. Alpha's debut flight looked like it went well at first, but a sensor cable had disconnected 15 seconds after launch, which eventually caused it to lose control when an engine shut down at transonic speeds. However, Firefly has managed to bounce back from this early failure, achieving a fairly consistent success rate and securing further contracts for future missions. Firefly has survived the Hunger Games, at least for now. One other failure in this department is worth talking about, and that's Kairos. A part of the Smallsat Hunger Games taking place over in Japan, Kairos is a solid-fueled rocket being developed by private company Space One and to date has had 2 test flights, both ending in extreme failure. The first, taking place in March of 2024, was rather spectacular. Have a look. The explosion was caused by the flight termination system, the first such system in Japan capable of ending a flight automatically without any human intervention. As it was the first, the criteria under which it could do so were fairly conservative. In this case, it was activated simply because it detected thrust and velocity below what it was supposed to be. A second attempt was made on December 18th, just 2 days before I write these words into my script, but around 95 seconds into flight, the rocket was observed tumbling out of control, terminating shortly afterwards. However, because it was only 2 days ago, a direct cause for the failure has yet to be determined. China has been making, or attempting to make, tremendous strides in the world of spaceflight themselves. Some may argue that their designs are derivative or clones of Falcon 9 and Starship. The truth is, rockets can sometimes be limited in what you can do with them. They're always going to be tubes with engines, and the ways you can land or recover those tubes is limited to like 3 options. Use the engines to slow down and let them sit on a set of legs, let them splash down with parachutes, or land them on a runway like the Shuttle, and good luck doing that with a traditional rocket booster. So they've been experimenting with established ideas, testing various engines and concept designs, and working their way toward their own reusable rockets. At one point during all of this, something rather amusing happened. It's always a little scary when a Chinese rocket fails due to their tendency to launch inland and somewhat close to populated areas. See, there's a reason KSC is located on the East Coast. It's because after only a few seconds, there's nothing but water downrange from the rocket. It's the same reason Baikonur Cosmodrome is in the middle of nowhere. But when something like, say, a Tianlong 3 first stage performs a static test fire so close to where so many people can see it, so much for static test fire. We've been calling that the world's first dynamic test fire. If you couldn't tell, the rocket wasn't supposed to launch. It was supposed to stay clamped to its test stand while the engine fired, but something in the stand clamps failed and it slipped through. What failed exactly? You won't believe this. The hold-down clamps were rated for Tianlong 2, this same rocket's predecessor, which produced only 600 tons of thrust. Tianlong 3, however, produces 900 tons, and the force of its ignition sheared straight through the bolts and sent the rocket flying, where it crashed harmlessly in the mountains, thank goodness. Space is hard, especially if you don't keep your infrastructure up to date. Speaking of space being hard, let's discuss the holy grail of rocketry, shall we? For decades, many industries were pursuing something that, in the end, may not be worth it, an SSTO, or single stage to orbit. A rocket that can make it to LEO without dropping a single part, negating the need to endlessly build new rocket stages. However, it turns out that's an absurdly hard thing to do. You know what's a lot easier, or at least feasible? Making a 2-stage rocket that you can reuse both stages of, and do it rapidly. Enter Starship. Now, the history of the Starship program can and will be its own video. Seriously, once it starts flying actual missions, expect a brief history of Starship video, it's on the list. But for now, we're focused on failures, and with this one there's a fair amount to talk about. Of course, I will first take note of how iterative development works. SpaceX's policy with developing and testing Starship has been to stay hardware rich, building plenty of prototypes that can be flown knowing full well that they may not achieve all of their goals, but flying them will provide valuable data to improve the next prototypes, making progress bit by bit with each test getting a little further each time. This exists in contrast to the old space method of developing everything to the nth degree on paper and then in software, making sure that the rocket is tested as much as it possibly can before it ever reaches a launch pad, doing the utmost to ensure a fully successful maiden voyage. This method is slower but tends to be more pleasing to investors who don't really know how this stuff works. The Starship method, however, is exciting. It gets people talking, it gets eyes on the monitors when a new prototype hits the pad, either going up or coming down. So let's talk about a few memorable incidents, but just bear in mind that when I say failure here, this isn't to say these test flights were failures, but that specific objectives were not achieved, but possibly could have been. The first noteworthy incidents are in the hop era. For a time, while Starship's booster stage was still in its design phase, the second stage, which we'll just call the ship from now on, was being tested in a series of high-altitude hops. The procedure was simple. Climb up to around 10 kilometers, cut the engines, move into a horizontal position for a glide phase controlled by the flaps and thrusters, then relight the engines, flip into an upright position, and come down for a controlled propulsive landing. Sorry, did I say simple? Yeah, that's not simple at all, is it? Hence the fact that it took a while to nail down this procedure. The first attempt using a ship designated SN8 achieved several flight objectives, climbing to an altitude of 12.8 kilometers, successfully cutting off its engines one at a time, then heading back down. However, when the engines relit, one gave off a distinctive green flame. The ship successfully flipped into position, but came down too hard, exploding on the pad. It was later found that the green combustion was a result of LOX-rich exhaust, as the header tanks didn't have enough pressure to push sufficient methane propellant into the engine. The fix was simple: install a helium pressurization system to keep the engines fed healthily during the flip maneuver. The next flight, SN9, had a similar outcome, with one engine failing to ignite for the landing burn and causing a hard landing and explosion, or RUD as they like to say. Quick note that while they may have popularized it, the term rapid unscheduled disassembly was not invented by SpaceX. It was first used in reference to a failed test firing of an Apollo S-4B in 1965. Anyway, what caused the engine failure? Hard to say. At this point in the program, the Raptor engines being used were still very much in development prototypes, and suffered a fair amount of reliability issues. They've since ironed out a lot of these kinks, but for a little while there, Raptor reliability seemed to be a major limiting factor of the Starship program. Finally, SN10 performed what appeared to be a successful landing, touching down under its own control on the pad, then promptly exploding 6 minutes later. Evidently, the landing was a little harder than it first appeared, one of the Raptor engines firing a little underpowered, again a result of that reliability slowly coming under control. With SN15, Starship finally performed a fully successful landing, and the program moved on to preparation for orbital flights. The booster had been fully designed and prototypes began to be built, monstrous vehicles with an unprecedented 33 Raptor engines powering them. A new plan for the reuse aspect was made. A massive set of arms on the launch mount, referred to as the chopsticks, would catch the booster and the ship out of a hovering position when they returned after flight, allowing them to be restacked for the next one on the spot. No more exposure to salt water on a drone ship, no more waiting for a long voyage home. The rocket would launch, then return to its launch site, and get ready for another flight then and there. They're making progress in that regard. One booster was already caught on the 5th test flight, but we're here to talk about failures, so let's discuss the first 2 Starship test flights. The first integrated test flight, taking place on April 20th, 2023, was a bit of a roller coaster. Musk had previously indicated that SpaceX may have jumped the gun on preparing for a booster launch without a deluge system beneath the launch mount, and he turned out to be right in that regard. Immediately at liftoff, 3 of the booster's engines failed, and 2 more were lost as the flight continued. The blast of ignition dug a gigantic hole into the ground beneath the pad, hurling concrete into the air and scattering it half a mile away around the launch site. 85 seconds into launch, SpaceX lost vector control of the engines, and as it rose to about 39 kilometers, it began to spin. At this point, the flight termination system activated, but nothing happened. For the next 40 seconds, a powerful rocket taller than the Statue of Liberty flipped end over end 3 times in the air, somehow didn't tear itself apart, and then finally exploded. There were a host of changes to improve the vehicle following this launch. Perhaps the most major was the installation of a water-cooled steel plate system beneath the pad, which had already been planned but not implemented before the first launch. This both protected the concrete, as well as provided deluge and sound suppression system to mitigate the damage the engines were capable of doing to themselves. A hot staging system was implemented, meaning the ship's engines would ignite before stage separation, preventing loss of thrust during the staging event. Significant reworking of the booster's fire suppression system was implemented, as this was what had caused the shutdowns and loss of communications on the last flight. The automated flight safety system was requalified, and a massive list of individual part improvements was drawn out and implemented. Starship's second flight went far better. First of all 33 engines worked throughout the booster's ascent. Hot staging also went successfully. However, the booster couldn't handle the forces of flipping around after being pushed away by the ship. As it relit its engines for a boost back burn, they began to progressively shut down, caused by a filter blockage in the LOX system. At T plus 3 minutes 21 seconds, the flight termination system decided too many engines had been lost and the booster was destroyed. The ship continued on, making it about 90 seconds away from engine cutoff, before it too lost communication with ground teams. It took quite a while to figure out just what had happened to it, but it was eventually learned that a planned venting of excess LOX caused a fire, which caused the loss of communications, shutdown of all engines, and activation of the flight termination system. SpaceX returned to the drawing board, implementing new fixes to both booster and ship, and as we know now, Starship is gradually working its way towards its goals of rapid reuse. Every flight gets better and better, and this time next year, it will be very interesting to see how far the program has come. Space is hard, but Starship is trying to make it easier, which, ironically, is not easy. Rockets will always fail. No technology is flawless. Nothing ever works 100% of the time. In the same way that every car can break down, every computer can glitch, and every handheld tool can be worn down to a point of no longer doing its job, nothing stays perfect. Nothing is flawless. With rocketry, it tends to be a little dramatic when failures happen, big explosions and losses of 7 figures at minimum, but we are a far cry away from the days of flipping a coin to find out if the booster you were going to sit on top of would even make it off the ground. Mercury astronauts had balls of steel because they had to, but nowadays it's getting a lot better, a lot easier to trust the most complicated machines mankind has ever built. Sometimes modern failures don't even matter that much. Look at the second flight of ULA's Vulcan rocket, which had an SRB nozzle explode during ascent, yet still made it to a nominal orbit and payload deployment. Maybe someday we'll be able to say space was hard, but for now, every astronaut who ever flies will need to pucker a little bit. To paraphrase John Young on his debut flight of the Space Shuttle, anyone who sits on top of the largest hydrogen-oxygen fueled system in the world, knowing they're going to light the bottom, and doesn't get a little worried, does not fully understand the situation.